This is Conversations on Careers and Professional Life, a podcast from the Foster School of Business, MBA Career Management Office. I'm your host, Gregory Heller. On each episode, I talk with guests from faculty and staff to students and business leaders about the skills and strategies that can help you design a professional life that you're happy with. On this episode, I speak with Professor Warren Boeker. I asked him on the podcast because of his work studying innovation and design thinking in particular. A few years ago, we introduced the concept of life design using design thinking to our students and made it part of our professional development orientation programming. I had the opportunity with some of my colleagues to visit the D School at Stanford and get trained on designing your life curriculum, and more recently took a design thinking course from IDOU. Increasingly, we're seeing job postings that mention design thinking, and I thought Warren might have some insights to share. I hope you'll enjoy my conversation on careers and professional life with Professor Warren Boeker. My guest today is Professor Warren Boeker, the Douglas Olesen Battelle Chaired Professor of Management at the University of Washington's Foster School of Business. Professor Boeker's recent research has examined the dynamics of strategy formulation and execution in organizations at a corporate and business level. His other work focuses on the innovation process and organizational creativity, including idea generation, developing products into profitable businesses, and diffusing ideas throughout the organization. I'm excited to talk with him about design thinking and his course, Technology Innovation and Design Thinking. Professor Boeker, Warren, welcome to Conversations on Careers and Professional Life.
Thanks, Gregory. It's great to be here.
So, as I said in the introduction, I'm really excited about design thinking. I think that in the career management office, we use design thinking in the form of designing your life with our students to help them think about this problem of what they're going to do about their careers. And I was really excited to hear that you're teaching this class on design thinking. Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Sure. Well, actually, the course is on, as you mentioned, technological innovation and design thinking. So we focus a lot on sort of the dynamics of industries driven by innovation. And really what I try to do is provide a series of frameworks for managing more technology-intensive businesses. So the first step in any kind of innovation effort in a company, so we're focused on innovation and specifically the management of innovation. And really the first step in any innovation effort is coming up with ideas in any organization. So we talk a lot about design thinking, and I can tell you more about how we do it in the class. I also talk about other techniques or approaches, innovation jams, hackathons, venture boards, innovation councils, even, traditional brainstorming, although that's been updated a lot, open innovation networks, crowdsourcing. So lots of ways to come up with ideas. And then we kind of move from that, which is part of design thinking too, to sort of a selection model of, and interestingly, in many companies, the challenge is not coming up with ideas. They have lots of ideas. The question or the challenge is around which idea should we actually try to commercialize. So we spend time in that too. And design thinking also applies there a lot in terms of prototyping and in terms of just kind of implementation or acting off of the design thinking efforts.
Aside from taking your course, what are some of the ways that you think that MBA students can prepare themselves to be effective in these types of technology companies to effectively help generate ideas and identify the ideas that are most likely to be successful commercially?
Sure. Well, I think there's honestly the design thinking process is important. You mentioned in career management how you use the sort of designing your life approach, which is very similar and kind of an outgrowth of the more traditional design thinking. But there are lots of activities outside of there. I could say that one way I also pose this in the class that might be interesting to the students is there are a lot of consulting firms that actually focus on this as well. And interestingly, a lot of those companies that were focused on design thinking have actually been acquired then by larger companies, whether it's the BCGs or the Accentures or whoever. So I've in the past used a good friend, colleague of mine, T. Linehan from Fjord, which is a design and innovation group from Accenture, but they were independent before that. So they're working on that as well. In terms of just how MBAs can better understand, I think, the innovation process in technology-intensive businesses. Really, as I mentioned, it involves coming up with the ideas, selecting among ideas, and then we spend a lot of time in class on kind of commercialization. How does that happen? So also issues around where I've seen MBAs get involved is around understanding how to sort of manage intellectual property, and then understanding opportunities for collaboration. Lots of businesses today use everything from any kind of partnership, from joint ventures to licensing to sort of more open innovation models to incubators, accelerators. So there are lots of opportunities almost along the value chain of innovation if you want to think about from the initial idea to the ultimate commercialization of the idea into a successful product that MBAs can get involved, including project management, things like that.
Is that selection process mostly driven by financial concerns? Like, is it NPV positive, or are there other concerns that really factor heavily in it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the things I try to distinguish in my class between is sort of more traditional decisions about, project launches, product launches, where you're focused a lot more on internal rates of return and NPV and things like that, versus totally new ideas where it's really difficult to get a sense of, what is the internal rate of return going to be. And so the metrics and the systems used to kind of evaluate those are quite often different as well. There's a lot of prototyping, which gets back again to design thinking, coming up with ideas, doing beta testing with clients and customers, creating minimally viable products that they can kind of test out. So the idea is it's very iterative and it's working as in design thinking where you're working with the client or the customer a lot. You're focused a lot on what works, what doesn't work, and getting feedback from them along the way to really come up with a product. So people talk about the stage gate process, which is moving from one stage of the idea to kind of the next in terms of just going from the initial idea to gates along the way, kind of the go, no go, should we go forward with this project or not? And I think a challenge for many companies is coming up with sort of the specific metrics they need to use in order to make decisions to go forward or not. Once companies initially invest in an idea, quite often it's more difficult to kill. So they actually need to set up a system so we can say, if it doesn't meet these specific goals, we need to be able to kill it or stop the project from going forward.
Are there any trends that you're seeing in tech companies these days around that? The launching and then perhaps killing of ideas?
Well, COVID's changed a lot of things in many companies. I would say there's been more of a proliferation of ideas, and I think just the way that innovation happens across organizations is really changed in some interesting ways. I talked before about collaboration. There's much more of a focus on what's often called open innovation and taking ideas, out licensing your own technologies, licensing technologies from other companies, sharing, and that might be just in the form of a simple partnership. It might be more of a joint venture, which is much more of a serious commitment or an alliance. And then using incubators and accelerators within the organization to do that has become more prevalent. I think the other thing that's happened for many organizations is their corporate venture capital arms have become really active in terms of investing in new ideas. So you always have the sort of traditional, early stage angel investors coming in, funding companies or individuals that have ideas, and then maybe later VCs come in to take it at later stages. But companies themselves, Google's a great example. Amazon's doing a significant amount of this. Facebook, to some extent, of just using their own corporate venture capital to make decisions about new technologies and trying to invest in those in early stages.
Does that help insulate the company from that project? Like, does it keep it sort of cloistered until it, comes out of the barn, as I guess they used to say, comes out of the garage? Is that why a company might use an internal venture unit rather than just roll things out like within the existing sort of structure of the company?
Yeah, well, there are a couple of advantages. One is quite often you want to keep those individuals, I wouldn't say isolated, but separate from the rest of the company. So you've got sort of the parts of the company that are working maybe on core projects for the company, but then the parts that are working on the parts of the company that are working on new ideas. Sometimes that's in a research group, like Microsoft Research is huge and pretty substantial. But also within the company, quite often these efforts around just creating internal ventures is really useful. And then the funding mechanism is one of the interesting points I was making, is really around the decision if we've got excess capital, which a lot of these companies do, uh, should we invest it internally or should we be looking outside our organization and actually helping to seed and invest in entrepreneurs and small new ventures that have ideas, either that we are interested in ourselves, or companies like Intel is a great example of an incredibly successful corporate venture capital group that is as good as or superior to a lot of the VCs down in Menlo Park in terms of selecting and choosing great investments that they've made lots of money off of, and most that don't even have anything to do with any of Intel's core businesses. So one of the key questions for an organization is to the extent to which we want to invest in technologies that we're interested in, and we want to get sort of a window on that technology versus some of these corporate VC groups just become like traditional VCs. We're just looking for good ideas and we want to develop those.
Sort of diversify rather than staying within the narrower focus of what the company does.
Right. And that always becomes a key question. Is how far do we want to get outside of what we see as our core products, our core ideas? And that's another reason in some cases to somewhat isolate some of these innovation efforts from the core business of the organization. Amazon has the 126 labs, which are down in Cupertino, that are actually the ones that developed lots of the products like the Kindle and other things that were separate from Amazon's more retail focused group and from AWS as well. So the question becomes, where do we invest, and also how do we organize that? I mean, how do you really structure those organizations within Alphabet? You've got the X division, which is all of these kind of new ideas, some of which work. They've got a great robotics division within X, the X division, which is all their new ideas. And then others, frankly, that don't work. They had this idea of using balloons for internet access as an internet access point, sort of like a satellite, which really hasn't panned out. And they've shut that down just fairly recently. But keeping those kind of separate from the core business so that the core business can keep focusing on what they do well and these innovation efforts can go along. And of course, the issue becomes, or the question becomes, do we integrate those back within the core business at some point if they're successful? Or do we try to keep them separate and try to grow those and then become independent divisions? And that's sort of what Alphabet does, and companies like Microsoft to some extent too.
Are there any insights you have about how students can move into these types of opportunities at some of the larger tech companies?
Right. Well, I think when I think about most of the tech companies and the hiring, it really depends. And certainly the career management group does a great job in terms of identifying opportunities for the
Thank you
students.
very much.
Yes, to do that. I also teach. It's interesting. I'll just draw a couple of contrasts. I teach this course mostly, or I have traditionally, in the technology management MBA program. And the sort of characteristics of those students are a little bit different in that they're typically working for technology companies. They're mostly engineers in terms of their background, but people that have very little exposure to business. So I think their motivation most often for coming to the technology management MBA program is to better understand how business works. And they really, they've had a technical background. They know a lot about the technologies. They don't know so much about business. Whereas I think most of our MBAs, many of them come from technology companies, of course, and have technology backgrounds, but also you've got kind of a broader set of backgrounds that people are coming from. So I think the advice I would have, or where I've seen people kind of fit in, is there are project management roles that involve lots of these different elements of the project and kind of understanding how to manage the project. I just mentioned the sort of stage gate approach. I mean, that's very much a business or management approach that companies use, but quite often engineers are not very familiar with it. And so there's lots of value added that I've seen in companies in terms of individuals that have an understanding of how business works, and then translating that into these technology companies where quite often you have individuals with great technology backgrounds, technical backgrounds, but maybe less exposure to business.
If a student that doesn't have that technology background but really wants to get into technology innovation, are there paths that you have seen be more successful than others? Are there recommendations that you have in terms of either courses in the program or other experiences that students can really try and get while in the program that can help prepare them for careers in technology innovation?
Right. Well, I think, if I take it kind of systematically, I think you'd have to look at the companies that are hiring, what the positions are traditionally that they've had that involve some element of technology. But again, merging that with a business understanding, I think would be the important dimension. So if you don't have if you're not an engineer in terms of your background, you can certainly, of course, work for a technology company and be incredibly successful. But it's a matter of finding positions where your skill set matches things that they need. So I mentioned project management. I think that's the one that comes to mind most readily when I think about Microsoft or Amazon, for example. Trying to think of other examples offhand. I think the other area that's interesting in terms of just understanding technologies and understanding, frankly, innovation is around some of the incubator opportunities within organizations. I know people that have gone to work for companies like Nokia. I mentioned Amazon 126 that really, again, are coming from more of a business background that understand the way business works and project management works within those settings. In terms of courses, I think project management courses do well. I think my course, frankly, modestly probably helps in terms of understanding. But those kinds of courses, I mean, I would focus more on the sort of outcome-based courses in terms of management, in terms of maybe marketing. And of course, if you really want to get into things, other areas like analytics and things like that, you can take courses in sort of operations management information systems and things like that that become relevant.
Just in the time since we've started using Designing Your Life, which is about the last 4 years, I feel like I've seen an increasing number of students arriving in the program with some knowledge and experience of design thinking. Now, it's still a small fraction that have used design thinking in the workplace in a previous role. So a lot of the concepts around design thinking are new to them. Could you maybe talk through the critical steps of the design thinking process?
Sure. Yeah. They're basically, I think design thinking's been around since 2005-ish with IDEO, one of the first companies that really started framing this. And really, for most companies in this space, they follow, and there are lots of different companies that do this, and companies, larger organizations do this within their own organization. There typically are 4 steps that people talk about. The first step is really around observation. And there's one of the things that's interesting and different about design thinking is this idea of immersion with the customer, understanding how they're framing things, how they see the world. So rather than coming in and assuming that, okay, we understand how this works for the customer, really understanding from the customer's perspective, how can we innovate and what would be innovations that would be useful to the customer? So trying to frame opportunities around that. And again, the empathizing with the customer, the client, the observation, the immersion part of that is really the first approach. Then out of that, there's a lot of sort of development of ideas, brainstorming, if you will, really trying to create the possibilities, what might work here, what might be effective. And that's quite often the kind of caricature of design thinking is a bunch of people running around, writing Post-it notes and putting them on boards and things like that and trying to group them together. But that's after all of the observation happens. So one of the activities we do actually in my class is I have students, the technology management courses over in Kirkland, they go into Bellevue during class, literally, and we do some work in terms of, we go through the entire rubric of how do you do this. But then they also go, and I've done this at the U in Seattle, just going out to the app and look at one of the great examples we always use when they're open, if this is scheduled right, is the the post office that's there on the app. And how would you design this differently? What are the things? Look at the customers. Look at the people coming through. Look at the flow. What are they doing? What are they trying to do? How might you change this? There's a great firm that's opened up there. It's been there for a while now. Grocery store H Mart, which is kind of an Asian-focused store, which is kind of really interesting for people to go into who haven't been into because they look at it from very different eyes. Anyway, you're trying to create possibilities out of this. You kind of group some things together, and then you really start to evolve to the prototyping stage where you're trying to define the direction that you want to try to go. And this is where, in an ideal world, you are iterating with the client, with the customer, and saying, here's some ideas, what's your reaction to this? And creating some prototypes of products or ideas. There's lots of emphasis in design thinking because most of these people that initiated it came from design schools to actually create literally physical prototypes of some of these things, or at least drawings that kind of explain what's going on. And then after you go through this process of iterating around that, the actual implementation or the release of the product is kind of the last step of the process. So typically 4 steps. There is an interesting difference between design thinking, some minor differences really, and what are called design sprints, which are actually also used a lot by organizations. Design thinking processes can take some time. I mean, a few weeks to actually go through the entire process in terms of, again, observing the customers, understanding what they're doing, what they're going through, and coming up with ideas. Design sprints, using the term sprint, it's very short. It's usually about 4 days. And you start, rather than spending lots of time talking to the customers, usually the challenge or the issue for the customer is kind of laid out for the group. It's like, our customers want this, this, and this, and we want to come up with ways to do that. And so the kind of problem set is defined early, and then the brainstorming occurs after that in kind of the prototyping. And there might be representatives from customer groups, but it really isn't, the kind of deep ethnographic discovery that you might find in a traditional design thinking approach.
How do you think COVID has changed this process just in the last year, during the last year for companies? And how do you think it will change it going forward as more and more companies move to flexible work arrangements, work from home, work remotely, lots of smaller satellite offices and things of that nature? Is that going to significantly impact the way design thinking is deployed within organizations or necessitate changes to the way design
Yeah,
thinking is deployed?
right. Great question. The first part of that, COVID has had a major impact on design thinking activities. Because as I mentioned, the traditional or typical design thinking approach is you look at customers, you look at their interactions, you look at what they're doing. You can't do that now, or you can't do it in the same way, certainly.
Got to do
So
it
that's
from at
what
least 6 feet away, right?
at least 6 feet, and even there, you won't even see the customers coming in necessarily as you did before. And the customer behavior has totally changed because what you actually want to try to understand is how is the customers behaving and how might they behave differently in different environments and things like that. So there are parts of it that still work, and certainly design thinking firms have continued to operate as consulting firms have during this time. But to the extent that they really are focused on customers, on clients, and observation, that obviously becomes more challenging, more difficult. In terms of like the post-pandemic, approach to work and hybrid work and maybe more flexibility, maybe more work at home, that might affect things. I think it might affect things less though, because I still think of these projects as being scoped in somewhat similar ways. I don't think it'll necessarily change, assuming we get back to something approaching normalcy or pre-COVID in terms of our activities. I think at that point, firms that are doing this work could go out and basically use the same approach. It might just be that there obviously are many opportunities, and lots of firms are talking about this in terms of, how do you serve a workforce that is commuting less, is at home more, what do they want, what do they need more of, what do they need less of?
It's almost like a meta design thinking process of thinking about how we change the way we work.
That's right. That's a great point. Yeah. So it's how is this all going to happen? yeah, from the standpoint of work and observing work. How does work occur, and how has the way work occurs changed, and how do we interact with others, and yeah, to what extent, how do we collaborate? All of those things, the use of Zoom or and other devices, other approaches to collaborate has changed the way a lot of companies work.
I did a company research project. They came into my house and they observed me using an app and a set of devices in my house to see how I was using it. And they asked me a lot of questions, and there were, four people and there was a
Yeah,
camera, and this was before the COVID times and everything. So that was a big ask, right? Like, can we
right.
come into your house and watch you do this? I
Hmm.
almost wonder if it becomes easier because we have become so comfortable, let's say, inviting people electronically into our home to watch us, right?
Hmm.
While we're
Hmm.
on Zoom, I wonder if it actually opens up an opportunity for perhaps even some more candid observation of people through technology. Have you thought about or heard anyone talking about how new technologies, whether it's sensors or things like telepresence devices like the Amazon Show device or the Google
Hmm.
device, how these types of devices and technologies may be able to augment the design thinking process and collect more information about users or customers than would be able to be collected by human observation?
Yeah, that's actually been an interesting issue for a while, even pre-COVID. There's lots of work on sort of creating almost the Truman Show or some reality show where you have these equivalent of webcams everywhere in a person's house. You have to get people to agree to do this and keep
Right.
them out of some places like the bedroom or the bathroom.
Mm.
But watching just interactions and just focusing on what are people doing. There have been some initiatives around that. The challenge there, obviously, I guess, is recruiting people that are willing to participate in that, and those that are willing to participate are those broadly representative sample of your potential clients, or are they kind of outliers in some way? They're either very tech comfortable or savvy, or just willing to let other people into their lives, sort of like the real world or something like that. Yeah, but that's been talked about for a while. And yeah, certainly with technology becoming less obtrusive, you could do that.
And I think about, so much technology innovation is not even about hardware. You talked about how design thinking has historically been thought of as a process for creating physical items. But there's also so much software. Software is eating the world, right?
Well,
The apps that we use every day, and those apps can obviously track, you know, where we're clicking, how long we take to click something, how much do we scroll. So there's that active data collection behind the scenes, right? Ambient data collection
mhm.
or something like that. That must some of these firms must incorporate into their process and guide some of the innovation that they're doing.
Oh, absolutely. And that's actually a huge growth area for sort of broadly design thinking ideas, is looking at UX and UI, user interface and user experience, around just what are people doing, and a lot of the prototyping around software is, and around design of software is, seeing trying a prototype of something, seeing how people click through things. What did they observe? What are they drawn to in terms of, oh, that box over there, that looks interesting, I'll click that on, that looks like something. Or obviously just saying, I don't understand what this is supposed to be, there's some kind of thing here that I guess I'm supposed to click this button, but maybe not. And that's in real time too, and doesn't even necessarily need to use all of the tenets of design thinking. It's much more of a kind of design of software, user experience, and user interface
A/B
question.
testing sort of approach.
Yes,
Like if we
exactly right.
change the size of this button or if we change the color of this link, what happens? Let's do it for a subset of users and
Exactly.
see.
Exactly.
Are there particular skills that students can develop that can help them with that domain? Like, is that an analytics heavy discipline? And if students take classes in analytics, they'll be more prepared to be involved in that type of innovation?
Yeah, I think that's true. That's exactly where I would place it. I think it's much more of a analytics approach. It's understanding something about um, user interface ideas. There are design schools. We have, within the engineering school at the University of Washington, a human-centered design group that does a lot of work with that. And those, but I think within the business school arena, the courses on data analytics and using data to some extent. And I'm not certainly being a management professor, kind of conversant in all the things they do, but certainly would probably be the best place to start.
Are there any areas of this discipline innovation that really excite you at this moment that you think, the next couple years is going to be really interesting for how X happens?
That's a great question. I think that I think there are huge opportunities. I think a lot in sort of software development would be one area. I mean, obviously there are things around apps and social media, but I get less excited by those than I do around things that might be around genomics, might be around nanotechnologies, quantum computing, things like that. So very kind of technology focused. But then even they're very technology focused, but maybe even more basic questions around electric cars and creating batteries, better batteries, and self-driving cars, and all of those initiatives, I think, are going to be fascinating in the future and really have an important impact on how we work and how we live and kind of how people get ahead.
Yeah, I am certainly much more excited about things like innovations in electric cars, batteries, energy, health, and science than in innovations around disappearing photos and social media things. Right? It seems like there are so many real problems that
Hmm.
we can address in the world today. We don't really need to go looking for some of these or frivolous kind of activities that so many apps seem to really take us towards. Um, for students who really want to dive into this area of technology innovation, are there particular books or podcasts or other resources that you recommend they might follow?
Let's see. Well, there are lots of podcasts out there. I'm trying to think of ones that would be. It really depends on the individual's sort of set of interest around innovation. Galloway's got some good ones. Who's a NYU professor that
Yes,
focus a
I'm a
bit
big
on
fan of Scott Galloway.
yeah. So I think his in terms of Wired magazine. I'm just some basic things. I mean, Wired magazine is always and still, I think, a good place to look for things that are interesting, and even old kind of you know old school publications like Harvard Business Review have sort of tried to pivot much more toward technology and kind of new ideas and things like that. So there's some good ideas there and things that are written in a thoughtful way and certainly focused on managers. So that and Sloan Management Review actually tries to, which is an MIT publication, tries to distinguish themselves a bit by saying we're more technology focused. So that's another good place to look. Yeah, those would be the ones that I would spend the most time with. There are books that come out that are around creativity. Adam Grant has a pretty recent book that's kind of interesting called The Originalists. There are others, but I don't know if I would strongly recommend them. They're interesting to read, and they tell good stories, and they're sort of like a Malcolm Gladwell kind of story, using social science to explain some kind of interesting phenomena. Those would be the places I would look.
I know that I enjoy reading the newsletters from MIT's Technology Review magazine.
Hmm.
And that magazine also, it's much more on the tech side than the
That's
business
right.
side, but
That's right.
it's very
Yeah.
interesting. And Harvard Business Review, I think, is one of the bang for buck subscriptions that I have, and I'm also a avid listener of a number of their podcasts. And I
Hmm.
think one that really looks at innovation and the way things are changing in business is After Hours. I'm not sure if you've listened to
Oh,
it,
I've heard of
but
that.
it's a
Sure. Sure.
yeah,
Yes.
handful of HBS professors talking on a weekly basis about things that are happening in the news and economy and businesses. And it just gives a really interesting higher level insight into the kinds of questions that academics like yourself think about when you see what's happening with companies that we all see in the news.
Yeah, no, that's great. The Economist has the occasional podcast that are focused on technology and technological developments. So there certainly are places to look for those. The question probably for the user is, and you mentioned the MIT technical notes, is that of, are you more focused on a technology or more focused on sort of the business aspects of the technology? And that's, I think for most of our students, they're interested in the technology probably, but more focused on the how do you actually apply this in sort of a business setting.
And for students who would really want to take like a crash course, perhaps not literally, but figuratively, in design thinking, are there publications or resources that you recommend?
Well, I know IDEO has resources. They even have, I think, courses they offer through their IDEO. Yep. I want to call it IDEO U or something like that.
Yep, that's what they call it.
Okay, good. Yeah, you might know more about than I do. The D School, the design school at Stanford, has done some initiatives, and some of those are going to be in the public domain. But I haven't tracked those carefully more recently. But that's another good place to look. There's and I'll mischaracterize this or give the wrong name for this, but there's if you're more interested in sort of the social impact end of the sort of spectrum, there's a Stanford publication around social ventures, and
Stanford Social Innovation Review.
That's it. Thank you. See.
Yeah. I received that for a while as well, and I still get their newsletters.
Yeah. So depending on what one's interests are, there are lots of available options out there. And I mean, one of the interesting things or one of the fascinating things to me is just there's such a plethora of different resources. I mean, really, it's information overload for most people. So I think 10 years ago, if you had asked me that question about, okay, where should you look or what should you read, it's a lot easier to answer because, as there are podcasts, there are videos, there are YouTube things, there are things through the D School at Stanford and other schools. There's what we're doing right now. There's other podcasts available, lots of written material, so it's almost overwhelming. But so a lot of the question or a lot of the challenge, I think, for people is to kind of be able to curate that somehow themselves.
Yes, and we will curate some of these links and resources, which you'll be able to find in the show notes at conversationsoncareers.com. I think this is a great place to end it, Warren. I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with me about your course, about technology innovation and design thinking. And thank you for being on Conversations on Careers and Professional Life.
That's my pleasure, Gregory. Thanks very much.
As always, you can find links to the resources Warren and I mentioned in the show notes at conversationsoncareers.com. Thank you for listening to another episode of Conversations on Careers and Professional Life. I'd love to hear what you think about the podcast. You can email me at gheller@uw.edu. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or classmate.